This afternoon, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Joan Copjec. Joan's PhD is in cinema studies from NYU, and she is a professor at SUNY Buffalo in the departments of English and Comparative Literature. She is also the director of the Center for the Study of Psychoanalysis and Culture. She has been the senior editor for the film journal October and is the editor of several excellent collections of essays such as Shades of Noir, Supposing the Subject, and Radical Evil. She's the author of 2 books, Read My Desire and Imagine There's No Woman, and of various articles. Copjec's intervention into the field of film theory has been substantial. Her essay, The Orthopsychic Subject, which many of you have just read, sitting here in the room, from Read My Desire, challenged the very structures of film theory from the 1970s and 80s, as represented by theorists such as Laura Mulvey. Copjec revealed to us that this film theory had misread Lacan's concept of the subject as it is formed by and as it interacts with the image or the visual field. She moves our understanding of subjectivity in film theory from one of mastery to one of lack. At the end of Read My Desire, she calls for a new ethics, one that is based on a more accurate understanding of Lacan's concept of the subject. And in many ways, she answers herself in her next book, Imagine There's No Woman. In this extraordinary book, she creates an ethics that doesn't require a limit. And she allows the world to see that the subject of philosophy has always been sexed, despite philosophy's disavowal of sex. More than critique philosophy, Copjec revealed what was always already at the heart of philosophy. Copjec finds the provocation for her theoretical inquiries in her engagement with cinema and other visual and performing arts. Her new book on shame, which she is finishing, it's on shame, the filmmaker Kiarostami and Iranian cinema, promises to continue her radical trajectory. Please join me in welcoming her to UVM.
Okay? Yeah. Okay, I want to thank Hillary and Todd for inviting me, and I want to thank you all for having me. I'm a kind of a refugee today from New York, and I'm glad to get out of the city. It's a miracle that I did, but I wanted to make it here, so I put in an extra effort to do so. I'm going to be talking about the film 10. It's a 2002 film by Kiarostami. I hope many of you have seen it. I have no clips. A rare moment of levity occurs in the film 10 when mother and son temporarily set aside the tensions that trouble their relationship. For the first time in our witness to their fraught interactions, they soar effortlessly along the highway without conflict or obstacle. The son, Amin, seizes this moment to express to his mother his wish that there were a gear faster than fourth, a flying gear, into which she could put their Land Rover. A tiny detail, this, but enough to encourage me to confess my long-held suspicion, namely that over the films of Kiarostami, whose most often repeated motif is that of a man driving continuously through the sparsely populated regions of rural Iran, there hovers an enigmatic philosophical fiction, Avicenna's Flying Man. Sometimes referred to as the suspended man, or the man in a void, this human creature is cast by Avicenna as part of a thought experiment into an unresisting, temperate space that permits him to remain oblivious to all the parts of his body and every other physical thing. This thought experiment is frequently compared to Descartes' experiment with hyperbolic doubt, because in both cases, body and soul are pointedly disjoined, and a certainty that I exist is ultimately asserted. The most striking difference between the two, however, is that unlike Descartes, Avicenna studiously avoids not only hyperbolic but even common everyday doubt. After projecting his hypothetical man into the void, Avicenna withdraws in order to allow the man, and this is a quote, to see if he affirms the being of his essence, for he will have no doubt about affirming that he exists, yet he will not affirm outward things about his limbs or interior things about what is inside him, nor anything else outside him, but he will affirm that he exists. That's the end of the quote. Commentators have protested that the argument begs the question of what or why the man will be able to affirm anything in the suspended condition. I would ask more pointedly, what argument? The Arabo-Persian philosopher proceeds directly, without pause or argument, from his frictionless fiction to the certainty he asserts. The absence of any argument and of any sort of scaffolding on which to secure the certainty that would seem to need securing has done nothing, however, to dull the power of Avicenna's fiction, which has been repeatedly reimagined since its invention in the 11th century. Mimicking Avicenna's gesture, Condillac later propels his marble statue into the void. Destutt de Tracy and Maine de Biran similarly send hypothetical creatures flying to see if they will encounter any resistance or confirm with certainty any elementary truth. Samuel Beckett will, in the most sustained flying fiction to date, suspend over the lip of an empty jar a bodiless head in order to see whether or not he will be able to assert with conviction who, what, or where anything is at all. Add to this list I am proposing the most recent invocation, the driving man of Kiarostami's creation. If the flying man has had such staying power over the centuries, one would have to concede that this is due not to its status as an argument, but to its status as a fiction. Avicenna himself never saw it as anything more than that, a supposition, a fiction, indeed, but a primal and necessary one. Or as we might now describe it, retrospectively, using the phrase later coined by Freud, a proton pseudus. A primary fiction or falsehood is different from a subjective lie, tendered by someone in order to lead another astray. For the former lie has an objective status, concocted not by a duplicitous subject, but of historical reality. It has a transcendental or grounding function for the subject who is subjected to it. Freud preceded his invention of the term proton pseudus with a confession. He could no longer believe in his original theory that an actual seduction was the cause of hysteria. While Freud was led to his first theory by the hysterics themselves, who endlessly recounted scenes of seduction by their fathers, he did not premise his retraction on the conviction that these patients lied to him. No, a falsehood had surely been perpetrated, but the hysterics were not its perpetrators. Freud's basic argument is that human temporality does not coincide with the temporality of biological development. Thus, by the time puberty arrives, along with the instinctual sexual knowledge attendant upon it, it is in a sense too late. For the subject, already stained, marked too early by sexual signifiers that she was not yet equipped to understand, is by then less than virginal. That is, there is no sexual instinct aboriginal with the subject, which is later derailed. The instinct is itself seduced on arrival, led astray from the start. But neither can we say that human sexuality breaks in from outside, from the great outdoors. Rather, what Freud referred to as the delayed onset of puberty, that is, the cleft in time that created two different series, pre- and post-pubescent, paved the way for the famous Freudian notion of retroaction, whereby the second series turns back and reinterprets the first. The proton pseudus, or what he would later call the primal scene of sexuality, is a fictive occurrence insofar and only insofar as it cannot be historically situated either in the pre or the post-pubescent series, nor for that matter in the memory or consciousness of the subject. It is instead the resonance of the one in the other. The first subjects of psychoanalysis, the hysterics, showed Freud that the event of sexuality, and in fact every event properly speaking, is historically unlocatable. It does not take place at any point in time, but somewhere in the air, so to speak, in an intratemporal interval. While the reminiscences from which hysterics suffered are memories of past that were never present, never lived, they are nevertheless inscribed by time. Kant was the first to appreciate the out-of-joint nature of time and its consequences for the human subject. And obviously, Avicenna did not have the benefit of Kant's insights regarding time. He did, however, have a kind of Kantian intuition of the subject's out-of-jointness with itself and maintain that one could possess a knowledge one did not know one had. He set out to demonstrate man's immediate self-knowledge, but this knowledge was too close to examine properly, and so he offered instead his fiction of the flying man. It is clear that in Avicenna's mind that this is a true fiction. If his fictional character is less certain of what the it is clear that in Avicenna's mind this is a true fiction. Although it is less clear, but if certainty attaches to the creature, it can be less certain of what the creature is certain of. The declaration of it is not so ringing, so clear as cogito sum. Rather, this is what Avicenna says, you will find that the flying man will be unaware of everything except the fixedness of his individual existence. The word translated here as existence and other times as essence is the subject of considerable debate. On this matter of translation, I'm not qualified to weigh in, but what interests me especially, and seems to me quite as crucial, is the word translated as fixedness. For it is this which is the center of the sentences and the certainty's gravity. What is one's fixedness? And why does it require a word as philosophically ambiguous as aniat, the word chosen to designate it? The hypothetical flying man responds to a question about man's knowledge, but my contention is that it cannot fail to be connected to Avicenna's strong position on the matter of inertia, of impetus or striving that keeps moving things in motion. Avicenna took the position, unusual for his time, that it was not a projectile's milieu that kept it in motion, but a permanent, immanent force, an inner striving. Might it not be this inner striving, this inertia, of which the suspended man is most certain? I am reminded at this point of the fact that Freud's own principle of psychic inertia, his own permanent force of striving or perseverance, which he observed in the compulsion to repeat, was similarly characterized by a note of apathy, which one finds in Avicenna. It too was a principle of fixedness, which aimed to sustain psychic life as in a void, indifferent to the pleasure meted out by the pleasure principle, and thus to a certain notion of life itself. The disentanglement of some of the apparent paradoxes of the much maligned concept of repetition compulsion is a major part of my task here. The reason I choose to do so in the context of Avicenna's hypothesis and Kiarostami's cinematic universe have to do, I want to show, with their overlapping concerns. Not only is Kiarostami's universe constantly crisscrossed by a man in a virtual bubble or void, that is his car, but actions are regularly repeated time and again to become the signatures of the actors who perform them. If I am correct in thinking that the flying man hypothesis hangs over this cinematic universe, I am, as far as I know, alone in doing so. This may be the fault of two alterations which obscure the analogy. The first is Kiarostami's decision to strew the flying or driving man's frictionless path with obstacles and accidents. The second, however deliberate it may be, is almost an unavoidable consequence of the change in genres. When Avicenna states that his hypothetical man is unaware of his bodily limbs, we are willing to temporarily disregard them ourselves in our attempt to entertain the hypothesis. The cinematic incarnation, however, has to exhibit the fictional creature's bodily form, which can no longer be bracketed. It is, in fact, the very specificity of this bodily form that so distracted Iranian feminists. The accusation they persistently levied against Kiarostami was that he was singularly indifferent to the condition of women in contemporary Iran, and sought rather to catch the eye of Western audiences by serving up what those audiences wanted to see: male protagonists driving through a timeless, rural Iran dominated by the ubiquitous presence of other men, with women shunted to the margins, hidden behind doors, or toiling in long shot on the fringes of vision. 10 is Kiarostami's response to his feminist critics. It is a woman this time who occupies the driver's seat of the Land Rover, which she navigates through the streets and highways of the notoriously traffic-congested city of Tehran. One by one, women, and women only, except for the driver's son, Amin, enter the bubble of her high-powered projectile, while men are exiled to the periphery, barely visible outside the windows of the car. But what, besides a response to his critics, is the film about? It seems that this Tehrani woman in the void is unable to avoid the stimuli, the distractions and attractions that surround her. She is suspended less in a temperate, frictionless space than on the horns of a dilemma. A modern woman, she wants to be free of all attachments, to be, as she says, a flowing river. She thus divorces her husband in order to pursue her own artistic interests, but feels guilty about having done so, which only leaves her all the more vulnerable to the tantrums of her son, who berates her constantly for her selfishness. To be fair, the son's attacks are not completely groundless. It is unclear if the mother chose the path of divorce freely, for she seems to be easily seduced by every new idea that comes along. When she goes so far as to tell her son that she does not belong to her, but only to himself, one cannot help but side with him in his violent and incredulous outrage at her naivete. She seems to have bought, hook, line, and sinker, all the Western liberal rhetoric about the possibility of being a completely unencumbered individual. Still, after giving a lift to an older man who is on her way to her thrice daily visit to the mosque and picking up a younger woman who has attended service there on the way back, she begins to try out the new ritual of mosque attendance. She seems now to be doubly torn, not just between her supposed desire for freedom and her guilt over sacrificing her son to it, but also between feminist and religious pieties. The argument has been made, however, that a certain form of feminism is consistent rather than at odds with the observance of traditional religious rituals, a practice women throughout the Islamic world have taken up in growing numbers over the last decades. This has been going on since the 70s in the Islamic world. This phenomenon, the mosque or piety movement, plays a significant role in the Islamic revival. One of the great merits of the film 10 is its refusal to close its eyes to the antagonisms that do not so much rip apart as constitute urban existence in Tehran. The film offers glimpses of life that, far from catering to Western expectations, are more likely to surprise them. Not only the insistence of prostitution, but also that of that urban movement which has galvanized women in Islamic countries to engage avidly in religious rituals and forms of religious sociability that had been formerly the providence of men alone. Responding to the feminist complaint that images of rural Iran offered Westerners a timeless, eternal view of their country, 10 set in the country's modern urban capital once again runs up against the question of temporality and eternity. On what time do these modern mosque participants operate? To whom or what do they address their prayers? What can prayer hope to accomplish today? A host of religious, political, and philosophical questions surround the piety movement, which some will object are only accidentally raised by the film. I would argue that however peripherally glimpsed, this movement cannot help but touch intimately on the project of Kiarostami, whose preference for patterns of repetition is remarkable not only in his individual films, but also in his fascination with Taziya, a traditional Persian passion play. Performed annually, the play each year retells the same story, known by heart by everyone in the audience, of the Battle of Karbala in 680, which ended in the defeat of the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Why this compulsion to repeat? What to make of this apparently inextricable insistence on returning to the past, on hearing the same story again and again? I think I'll take this part out. I need a quicker infusion. In Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival in the Feminist Subject, Sabah Mahmood attacks the parochial assumptions of liberal feminist politics as she carefully details the rise since the mid-1970s of mosque movements throughout the world, but particularly in Cairo. There is much to admire in this eye-opening book, but I will focus on the theoretical problems it raises for me. Because Western sensibilities are likely to be offended by what she describes as the non-liberal phenomenon of the Islamic revival, Mahmood rightly takes aim at the liberal conceptions of individual autonomy and freedom in which those sensibilities take comfort. This revival will not be measured but will directly combat many smug normative liberal ideas and tendencies, including the romanticization of resistance and the conceptualization of agency on the binary model of subordination and subversion. Although I agree that these assumptions are indeed in need of a good thrashing, I am less inclined to agree with Mahmoud's insistence that liberals assume that all human beings have an innate desire for freedom, that we all seek to assert our autonomy when allowed to do so. The official interventionist policies of Western governments do indeed make such claims, and their gullible citizens accept them as dogma. But Mahmoud also means to tar so-called liberal Western philosophers, Kant foremost among them, with the same brush, and here she is on more shaky ground. Kant, like scores of other Western philosophers, was struck by the same observation that scandalized Spinoza. Men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as if it were their salvation. Many Western thinkers were all too keenly aware that human beings do not assert their autonomy when given the chance, and there is thus very little evidence that freedom is a human desire. Because they start out with this assumption, these thinkers variously construct a more tortured notion of freedom than Mahmoud is willing to credit. Not a voluntaristic, but rather an obscure principle. Freedom is not for them a matter of will, but of a force that bypasses it. I have a few pages of critique of Mahmoud's book, which I'm skipping to get to arrive at the final and major central point. My central quarrel with politics of piety concerns our respective concepts of the human subject. Mahmoud's major objection to the liberal notion of the subject is that it is abstract, disembodied, a nebulous interiority that can be known only indirectly by the way it expresses itself in outward signs, some of them somatic. She defends instead a conception of the subject as embodied, which leads her to reverse the movement just described. That is to say, interiority no longer reveals itself when it does in exterior signs. Rather, external actions or bodily practices are defined as the terrain on which the topology of the subject is mapped. And it is they that give rise to interior feelings. So it's from the outside in rather than inside out. Thus, wearing the veil or participating in ritual prayer is not to be viewed as a way of demonstrating one's modesty or religious convictions, displaying it to the outside world, nor of signifying rebellion or cultural belonging. They should not be read as signs of an inner state, but on the contrary, taken as bodily practices that create modest or pious dispositions, like kneel down and you will believe, that kind. The heart of Mahmoud's theoretical innovation inheres in her decision to view the Islamic revival through the lens of Aristotle's notion of hexis. That's the Greek word, or habitus is the word often used, the Latin word, the same thing. If Kant is singled out as the liberal philosopher, it is not only for his theory of freedom, but also, and relatedly, for his repeated exclusion of habit from the domain of ethics. Mahmoud chooses the following statement from Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone to illustrate this argument. This is Kant. When the firm resolve to comply with one's duty has become habit, it is called virtue in a legal sense. It's about lawful actions. Virtue in this sense is accordingly acquired little by little, and to some it means a long habituation, but not the slightest change of heart is necessary for this, only a change of mores. However, the foundation of the maxims of the human being cannot be effected through gradual reform, but must be effected through a revolution in the disposition of the human being. That's, again, Kant. One could also add this example from the anthropology, from a pragmatic point of view, in which Kant asserts habit has the effect of depriving even good actions of their moral value because it detracts from our freedom of mind and leads to thoughtless repetition of the same action, i.e. mechanical uniformity, and so becomes ridiculous. An opposition is thus set up by Mahmoud between the philosopher most representative of Western liberalism, Kant, and Aristotle, the philosopher who had the greatest influence on medieval Islamic philosophy. But you'll see, you'll see now why I want to, why I began with Avicenna, because I want to say that you can't lump all of Islamic philosophy together. So, although the Islamic philosophers were readers of Aristotle, they had different interpretations. It is entirely appropriate, therefore, to point out, as Mahmoud does, that the Arabic word malaka essentially translates Aristotle's hexity, and to cite these definitions of the term. Malaka, again, habit, is that inner quality developed as a result of outer practice, which makes practice a perfect ability of the soul of the actor. Malaka, or habit, commands the actions of the limbs and makes every activity take place in submissiveness to it, to the point that all actions become subservient to an affirmation of faith. It is perfect faith. Okay, so you practice this habit, ritual habit, again and again, and you will have faith. Pay attention to those limbs, though. We have seen them before with the fiction of Avicenna's Flying Man. And you'll remember that Avicenna's Flying Man was adamantly unaware of those limbs. And later, Felix Ravison, author of a treatise on habit, will invoke them when he defines habit as a law of the limbs. And Merleau-Ponty, who defines habit as knowledge in the hands, again recalls them when he insists that it is the body which understands in the acquisition of habit. Mahmoud urges us not to view the increasing participation of Islamic women in religious practices and rituals simply as submissive behavior. This participation does not stem, she insists, from an innate desire for submission inscribed in Muslim women from time immemorial. Pious devotion to God and religious authorities may betoken to the liberal-minded nothing but submission, but Aristotle's distinction between habit or repetitious behavior and habitus persuades her to see in this pious turn something more active. For while it can only be acquired through habit, through submitting oneself to the discipline of repeated behaviors, habitus is not itself passive. It is a virtuous disposition or capacity, a manner of being. Habits are not acquired only passively by surrendering or submitting oneself to ritual forms. You have to actively acquire the habit. Only man is capable of contracting habits, and he does so actively through effort. Aristotle says that if you throw and Lacan quotes this, if you throw a stone in the air, however many times you throw a stone in the air, it will not acquire the habit of its trajectory. Only man is capable of contracting habits, and he does so actively through effort. One does not merely submit to a fashioning or molding of the self through ritual behavior. One must actively adopt a passive position, participate in self-fashioning. The contraction of habit does require a certain docility, but once formed, they define habitus, that steadfastness, incorruptibility, or fixedness, which is, I found, at the heart of the Avicenna myth. we associate with moral character. Habitus or hexity comes about through the procedures that work on or modify man, training, learning, discipline. But these procedures have the effect of inoculating him against modification or external influence. The repetition of these exercises lends man an unbudging, enduring force of character. Hexity or habit is an adverbial form of having, a having that is simultaneously a holding oneself, one's character or manner of being. Holding on to one's character or manner of being. That habitus is a capacity, a power, and not merely subordination or submission to traditional forms of behavior or recognized authority is the capital point Mahmoud wants to make. The capacity belongs, however, not to the women who participate in the Islamic revival, but to the authoritative discursive traditions whose logic and power far exceeds their consciousness. Thus, while women who engage in the piety movement do not resist structures of male domination, nor seek to free themselves from relations of subordination, Mahmoud asks us to locate adjectival capacity, that's her term, in the different ways in which they inhabit their relations. This is, to put it bluntly, too much congruence between forms of domination and the piety movement, at least as the politics of piety describes them, to convince me that the latter constitutes a feminist project of any sort, liberal or otherwise. I'm just talking about the way Mahmoud describes them. I can't say ultimately what about making a judgment about the piety movements until I study them more. And there is another way I will propose to approach them. The only opening, the only movement ascribed to the mosque movement, which otherwise seems a form of complicity by the women with their domination, stakes its chance on the impossibility of perfect repetition. Although the women do not consciously attempt to transgress the structures in place, the fact that they assume roles once reserved exclusively for men introduces a difference that destabilizes the structures. Any slight difference would, however, have the same effect, and thus every repetition will be merely approximate. It is thus not to the women, but to the inevitability of the inadvertently botched repetitions that agency is tacitly ascribed. I know some of you will recognize this as a position that is broader than Mahmoud. It's in fact the one that Judith Butler adopts. There's a slight variation, and therefore that's disruptive. Okay, Mahmoud's contestation of the liberal notions of revolt and transgression is appropriately genuflects to the work of Foucault, who argued, for example, in response to the events of May 68, that in attempting to liberate themselves from the constraints of power, the rebellious students were only tightening the noose. Foucault's underlying argument, though not his alone, is that an affirmation here of one's sexual freedom, which depends on a simple negation, always ends up serving that which it negates, here by embracing a politics of identity as if it were a politics of liberation, which it is not. If she succeeds in avoiding the specific liberal opposition between freedom and domination, Mahmoud still falls prey to Foucault's criticisms by implicitly retaining an opposition between the universal or general and the particular. Habits are general forms that can be subtly unsettled by particular circumstances of their performance and by those who enact them, or the particular instantiates a variation rather than an exact replication of the general. The general-particular distinction is an instance of the very problem to which Foucault draws our attention, for particular things never exit the orbit of the abstract general, but rather inhabit or remain cloistered within it. They are subsumed under the fixed term of the general in the same way as the change of water is subsumed under the permanence of the river in the Heraclitan fragment, everything flows, or in the way moments of a long exposure photograph are subsumed in the privileged instant of the portrait or pose. There would be no generality without the particular objects among which it picks out and names resemblances. But a general term is a mental construct that sits above the objects and is not any part of them. Thus, the relation between the general and the particular is external and restricted solely to the abstract one of subsumption. Moreover, precisely because the general is not a part of, but remains apart from, the particulars it includes, the latter are left without relation to anything other than themselves. That is, they remain self-identical. The problem of identity, of the insistence of the same, so long bemoaned by Foucault, among others, resurfaces whenever one looks to the particular as a way out. To place one's hope on the inevitable failure of repetition to bring about change or movement is to accept a false idea of both. The difference located in the inhabiting of authoritative structures differently is thus equally false or of little consequence. If the credibility of a generality relies on its actualizations, the former is nevertheless indifferent to the differences among the latter. For the absence of any but a logical relation to a generality prevents every particular actualization from altering generality itself. Every variation or imperfect resemblance between a particular thing and a generality only bears witness to the inferiority of the particular instance to the abstract general. In this context, it becomes clear that repetition, not its failure, is the radical idea. If it remains true that which seems repeatable is by definition resistance to exact repetition, then 1, the failure of repetition is anodyne, both politically and theoretically, and 2, successful repetition must repeat what is unrepeatable. By unrepeatable, we mean that which is unique or singular rather than exchangeable for something else, and that which has no fixed identity. The difficulty of this idea is attested by the confusion surrounding and indeed infusing beyond the pleasure principle, the text in which Freud slowly constructs a notion of repetition. Now, this idea of repetition is not unrelated to the one required for the acquisition of habit, as Aristotle conceived it. Freud took many of the latter's formulations into account while crafting his own, even as he felt that they fit in badly with the fabric of psychoanalysis, and none more badly than the notion that a principle of harmony ruled the cosmos, that an individual was a microcosm inhabiting a macrocosm, and that the acquiring of habit fitted man, eased him into conformity with the macrocosmic order of things. Freud's aversion to this principle is on display in his impassioned rejection of the idea that there is any such thing as an oceanic feeling, in which man felt at one with or immersed in a whole. Freud wanted, nevertheless, to understand the genesis of this feeling and reasoned that it must be a misinterpretation of that feeling that arises when the ego, the linchpin of our illusory sense of unity and autonomy, of being marked off distinctly from everything else, encounters the unconscious entity of the id, to which the ego is in fact partially attached. In short, Freud is arguing the supposed oceanic feeling of being engulfed by something larger than oneself is actually an experience of being semi-attached or detached from oneself, a sense of self-division attendant upon the experience of a painful pleasure. This is the fateful difference that distinguishes the world of Aristotle from the one in which psychoanalysis made its appearance. There is no longer an unmoved mover, a fixed transcendental instance assuring harmony between the outer world of the prime mover and the inner world arrayed beneath it. There is no principle of harmony operative in the modern world, and no distinction between outer and inner worlds. There is only one world. As a result, the distinction between the general and the particular loses its footing, and the repetition necessary for the constitution of hexity, that is, of our capacity for movement, change, action, can no longer be conceived as a molding of character, an external conditioning that tends the individual towards some good or right action. There is no telos, no finalism operative in our world. A chasm thus opens between the ancients and us, which forces us to rethink habit in fundamental ways, and this is what Freud does when he offers his theory of a compulsion to repeat. There is, however, a specific way in which the repetition by which we acquire our capacity loses its older orthopedic sense. I will focus for the rest on this point, which is also central to the concerns of Mahmoud. As she states, her aim is to show how the women in the piety movement learn to establish coordination between inner states, intentions, movements of desire and thoughts, etc., and outer conduct, gesture, action, speech, etc. She understands ritual, formal action as the means for making women's desires act spontaneously in accord with pious Islamic conventions. Her contention that the body must not be excluded from consideration of moral or political engagement is unquestionably sound. The problem is that she never conceptualizes the body, but treats it as a found object. She assumes, and I quote Lacan, that what lies under habit is what we call the body, and that the body is an object-like substance. Still quoting Lacan, what a bunch of bull. In Mahmoud's analysis, an orthopedics of the body is assumed to be at work to produce, through pious rituals and obedience to hijab restrictions regarding bodily movements, comportment, and dress, the appropriate, these are words that Mahmoud uses, appropriate or normative or correct words, all words that Mahmoud uses without raising an eyebrow, the correct affective response in the women, piety, modesty, submission to authority, all conventional, proper affects. As mentioned, the repetition of habit has traditionally been thought to establish a law of the limbs, one that harmoniously links a subject to her body. But this harmony is no more assured than the one that once linked the unmoved mover to the sublunary world. Simply put, it can no longer be said that we inhabit our bodies or even that we recognize ourselves in them. The embodied subject, the great what's it of contemporary theory, requires more reflection. It is certainly correct to insist that the subject has a body, but a mistake to conclude that she is her body, that she coincides with it. Between the thinking subject and her body, there is a fundamental disjunction, a cut, that cannot be sutured. Perhaps this perception was at the basis of the flying man's adamant indifference to his limbs, But we have to disagree with Avicenna and insist that there is no sense of self, of the subject's fixedness or perseverance that does not rely on an experience of the body in its division from thought. One does not dwell within one's body, but neither can one ignore it. One encounters it like a stray bullet. Contemplating the category of cause, Aristotle stops to consider the phenomenon of chance or coincidence, only to reject it ultimately as an improper instance of that category. He offers the example of a man who sets out for the market to buy goods, only to meet along the way a debtor from whom he is able to collect his debt. Because the man did not set out to recover his loan, the chance meeting that leads to its repayment cannot be understood as a cause, but represents, on the contrary, a failure of final cause. There is no cause for this coincidental meeting. What thus results from it lacks purpose or happens, as Aristotle puts it, in vain. Writing about Rossellini's Paysanne, André Bazin lingers on an episode in which a woman crosses the city in search of her fiancé, only to learn by chance that he is dead. The statement from which she learned the news was not aimed at her, Bazin points out, but hit her like a stray bullet. The worlds of Italian neorealism and Aristotle are, however, worlds apart. The former, stripped of the finalism that orders the latter, de-emphasizes strict causal relations in favor of accidents, such as the one in Paysanne. But if the accidents in these films do not happen for a reason, they are not uncaused, and they do not happen in vain. The drama of the Florentine woman does not simply disappear into insignificance. It ramifies and becomes part of the complete drama of the liberation of Florence. Of the accident-filled cinema of Kiarostami, a similar argument can be made. As in 10, where the drama of her mundane day connects the unnamed mother to the complete and shifting drama of the modernization of Tehran. Bazin famously argued that neorealism abandoned the abstract view of reality by replacing the shot, a simple unit of sense, with the fact image. From all I have said here, and all Bazin says on the matter, it should be clear that the fact image does not simply substitute concrete particulars for abstract generalities. Generalities and particulars reinforce even as they oppose each other. They operate together to form a unit. The fact image, which constitutes the fabric of neorealism's reality, is not just denser, more detailed, stuffed full with thousands of tiny facts. It reveals enormous ellipses, great holes, with this result. Its events fail to mesh like a chain of the sprockets of a wheel. What the fact image offers the spectator is, in a word, a singularity. As opposed to a particularity, a singularity is not self-identical. It is not filled entirely with itself. And this is so because something lodges itself there, like a door stopper, to prevent the singular thing from closing over on itself. The thing is what Deleuze calls the whole, but which others call the one, and it is called the one in Encore, in Lacan Seminar 20, on feminine sexuality. The whole, unlike an abstract generality which subsumes particular things, and you should think again about the oceanic feeling and how Freud conceived of this differently. It's not something that engulfs one. The whole, unlike an abstract generality which subsumes particular things, is a real part of the singular. This may sound like nonsense. How can a whole be part of something that makes up part of it? What prevents the whole from swallowing up subsuming the singularity. There is no answering these questions without conceding that the whole is never at any point given. The lonely hour in which it would finally be given, fully actualized, never arrives, because the whole is constantly being altered by the parts, the singularities that constitute it. Is this not one of the basic logics of Freudian psychoanalysis, the very logic of overdetermination, the reason for Freud's resistance to the idea of an oceanic feeling, and for his insistence that psychoanalysis was never conceived as a science of the individual, but always from the beginning as the various ways in which the difference between the individual and the group fell within the individual. There is no individual without the whole, the group, but the whole doesn't subsume the individual. That's the basic idea. The basic distinction between the singular and the particular prepares our return to the question of repetition and the body's place in it. Following Deleuze's formulation, we asserted earlier that the argument, as anodyne politically as it is theoretically, that there is no such thing as exact repetition, needed to be tossed aside in favor of the only viable argument. There is repetition only if what is repeated is unrepeatable, or repetition can only truly repeat what is singular. Deleuze immediately gives the example of festivals which repeat unrepeatable events. Bastille Day, for instance. It is far too easy to miss the point of this example because one spontaneously thinks of a historical event as unique or singular, in that it happened only once in the past and thus is over and done. A unique or singular occurrence is not, however, a one-time event, but on the contrary, one that has not finished happening. If an event were merely an actual occurrence, it would be self-identical, self-enclosed, but it is not. It is instead an actual occurrence which also has a virtual dimension, a relation to the whole, and opening onto the whole of time. Thus, while Freud pondered the question of why war veterans repeat the traumas of war, his answer inverts the question by defining trauma as something which is repeated. Deleuze founds his theory of repetition on a trance of pure or a priori past that was never present, but which must be presupposed in order to account for our sense of time's passing. For the present to recur, and thus to have a future, there needs to be this virtual object, the pure past, which cuts the smallest width of the present in two. The present it is, and the past into which it is receding. Freud, Bergson's contemporary, makes a similar deduction. He too posits an a priori before of the subject, which he calls the id. So I'm comparing the id to the pure past. Like the pure past, the id produces a cut, this time in the ego, which thus falls into that which it was and that which it will become. The statement of this fundamental thesis is well known. Wo es war, soll ich werden. There where it was, there must ego become. Freud's formulation resounds with an unmistakable echo of Aristotle. To ti en I nai, the what it was to be. The essence of a thing which takes place in a timeless present through an action or movement, or jouissance. This swarm of connections and comparisons interests me because they seem, in my thinking at least, to coalesce in a thesis, and I will be trying to work this out eventually. If there were no living bodies, there'd be no time, or time exists only because there are bodies. In psychoanalysis, the body is understood in a precise way, as the site of jouissance. This is why psychoanalysis insists, as common language in fact does, not that we are our bodies, but that we have them. not in the way one has an object we can possess, but in the way we have a capacity, a potential. That which is potential is not. It must be brought into being. Lacan explains his choice of the antique word jouissance at the beginning of the Encore seminar. And in doing so, he refers to it as the inheritance. Jouissance is the inheritance of something, a property, but a common property that we have the use of but cannot use up. If we encounter our bodies as stray bullets, it is because jouissance is not meant solely for us. It is common property in that it is an opening onto time and onto others. And two, jouissance always hits us by surprise, unexpectedly. It cuts into what is familiar, and opens new horizons, new possibilities. This is what Deleuze is getting at when he argues that the difference cannot be located on the level of the actual, but takes place only in the dimension of the virtual. Societies and cultures endure, if they do, only because they have a virtual dimension, in addition to an actual one of rules, customs, and so on. Festivals are important for keeping cultures alive, not because they keep the past alive and thus form an eternal present, but because they incite jouissance, which repeats the past by retroactively transforming it. Where the past was, the present comes to be by retroactively locating there its own possibility. Repetition doesn't limp along behind, trying to reproduce what has already been present, but produces what it repeats. I want to add this other, doesn't seem to go here, but I put it in. If one reads, I go from time to the question of affects, which I left stranded, I think, earlier in the paper, and I want to go back to. If one reads Aristotle's analysis of affects, one will find that they always firmly locate their bearers in an existing and hierarchically structured world. Aristotle's affects are, like Mahmoud's, by definition conservative. They serve to anchor the subjects in their world. It's simply unimaginable in Aristotle's understanding of affects that one could vibrate to a threat, a disturbing excitement that could not be located, that has no tangible form. If modern philosophy privileges the affect of anxiety, it is because our world remains open, that is, immersed in time. That is immersed in time. Okay, so that was simply to get rid of, to again question the kind of manicured affects that we find in Mahmoud's an analysis of what's going on in the piety movements. Kiarostami's film 10 may by now seem to have been a mere pretext for a discussion of the mosque movement, which, after all, is only marginally referenced in the film. I'll end then by saying that the film itself is structured through and through by the repetition compulsion. The film contains a countdown leader that numbers the sequences from 10 to 1, so that we may seem to end up at the beginning of something rather than at the end. The viciousness of a circle is surely implied. The original idea for the film was to have a psychoanalyst whose office had been closed down by authorities interview her patients in the alternative space of her car. This analytic idea remains intact in the finished film. For all who enter the woman's car sound a bit like Freud's patients' reports, their reports in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, who all give no impression of having learned any lessons from the past. from the past experiences of unpleasure, but repeat the same patterns as if under a compulsion.
We have time for questions.